Hello, everyone. It's a real pleasure for me to welcome you to this webinar, Bolster Ukraine's Wartime Resilience. For those who would like to follow us in Ukrainian, please, there is a small little globe that you can press. There it has different languages. Choose Ukrainian, and you will have the interpretation. So I hope you can all hear and understand us. I will briefly introduce myself. I'm Natalie Sabanadze, Senior Research Fellow here at Russia and Eurasia Program of Chatham House. And it's really a great privilege for me to lead this timely discussion, especially in the context of what I would call Ukraine's resilience miracle. You know, there are words that just take over our political discourse, and then they very quickly disappear. But resilience has proven to be very resilient as a concept and as a word that we're learning to work with more and more. When it first appeared, I must say that I was quite skeptical because I was in Brussels then, and I felt that this was the word that was being used instead of security. It was kind of displayed a degree of unease of the European Union about all the issues related to hard security. And I felt like, why can't they use normal words like security that are understandable and translatable in all the different languages? But the times have changed. And I think when we look at what has been happening in Ukraine, Ukraine has become a living image of resilience, its explanation as well as its illustration. It is to a large degree a reference point for this concept, for resilience, which is both individual and collective. But I think we should not take Ukraine's resilience for granted. It is a finite resource, and it needs to be sustained both from inside and outside. So our discussion on this subject is meant to inform Ukraine's recovery conference, which is going to be held in Berlin in June. And obviously, Ukraine's reconstruction effort should replenish that Ukraine's resilience resource. So we have a fantastic panel today to discuss what are the current sources of Ukraine's societal resilience, what are the risks that they face, what does Ukraine's home front need to continue fighting, and how can donors, Western partners support Ukraine's resilience in concrete terms, and what have we learned so far from Ukraine's experience? I would like to briefly introduce the panel. We will start with Orysia Lutsevich. She is the Deputy Director of the Russia and Eurasia Program at Chatham House and the Director of the Ukraine Forum at Chatham House. I will then invite Yulia Yurchuk, a lecturer in the history of ideas at Southern University, followed by Katarina Zarembo, who's a non-resident fellow at Central European University and an associate fellow at New Europe Center. And we will have a couple interventions also from our audience. But let me begin with Orysia, who has been researching resilience for many years, and who have even found the ways how to measure it and operationalize it. I would like to ask you to begin with defining resilience for us and telling us about the barometer that you have been working on, because we know resilience is a notoriously difficult concept to measure. And it is linked to a large degree to prevention, which is also very difficult to prove. It is about readiness, but it is also about prevention. And how do you prove that something that did not happen was actually caused by certain events? So I think it's very interesting to begin how you deal with this concept, how you operationalize, what are the parameters that you look at, and what are actually the sources of Ukraine's resilience? Thank you.
Thank you very much, Natalie. I'm glad you could join us. And Natalie is a senior research fellow at Russia and Eurasia Program as well. And I think that we at Chatham House started looking at resilience and what it means for countries in the region of Eastern Europe, especially countries bordering Russia, Ukraine, Belarus, Moldova, Georgia, to actually to be able to sustain their own choices, to be able to consolidate their democracies where it was on their agenda. And we've seen Russia deploying a lot of coercive methods to undermine these societies. So the journey into understanding resilience started from that. We saw that pattern coming. It was taking place for decades. It resurfaced a lot, before actually the launch of the annexation of Crimea, around color revolutions that were shaking the region from, the Rose Revolution in Georgia to Orange Revolution in Ukraine. So we saw this pattern, and we saw these vulnerabilities that societies had to Russian influence. But then the question turned upside down and was, how can these societies protect themselves? How can they insulate themselves? How they can mitigate risks and still be able to, in the case of Ukraine, pursue its path to European integration, NATO integration, reforms, a human rights-based society? And this is the question why. And this question why really strengthened for us during the full-scale invasion. People on this call know that I work a lot with trying to understand civil society, its role. And when last year we were questioning Ukrainian NGOs about what is the added value in rebuilding Ukraine now during the wartime, almost 80% of Ukrainian organizations from the regions of Ukraine outside of Kiev said that it was to contribute to resilience and to contribute to social cohesion. So here was for me a question why we should be understanding this. It's because people in Ukraine on the ground understand that this is a useful tool. So I'll share a couple of slides because all of this information is available online, and you can easily find it. But just wanted to start with this, of course, image that many of you may know, recognize. Some of you don't, but where is resilience on this picture? And it really is right here. It's right here. This little rooster from Ukrainian ceramic factory near Kiev that survived the bombardment of building in Borodyanka, that became, by the choice of Ukrainians themselves, a symbol of resilience. And when, Natalie, you were asking me, how do we define resilience? What is it? If you look at this rooster, you may say it's actually surviving a violent shock, is to be able to stand in times of assault on your very existence, right? But it is also capacity to prepare for the future disruption, right? It's something that societies should be thinking about, and actually recover from shock. Recover from shock, possibly even stronger, and that is, I would say, the highest level of resilience of any society or an individual than before. It's learning from this violent experience to fortify for your systems, your response to future adversity. And that is why, we were trying to think whether there could be a comprehensive system that could capture what it is that we want to see in the society that is resilient. And of course, like you said, perhaps Ukraine became even like this victim of resilience, where a lot of people, lean back on this, hoping that this will help carry out Ukraine throughout the war. And our task in Chatham House, when we look at this concept, was to try to suggest some pillars where, if we look at the society as a whole, and it's not just as individual, how we could look at some of the qualities that would tell us how strong or weak a certain community is. And these are the 5 pillars we are looking, from human security to cognitive resilience. And each of those pillars has 7 indicators. So overall, there are 35 indicators. We did not test this methodology on Ukraine. I would like to make it very clear. This was tested in Moldova. It was designed to be under the threshold of full-scale kinetic war. It's a society that feels pressure from outside to undermine its course, and it's for those sharp powers of malign influence who want to, especially in our region, is Russia. So we've surveyed experts, independent experts, non-government experts, about how they see this in Moldova. And this is just to illustrate the outcome of this. Based on this survey, where you could see in Moldova, people feel that human security remains quite vulnerable, weak, whereas economic agility remains quite, is more solid. So how can we use this? And I do believe that when we are looking at Ukraine right now, the country at war, we can, to a degree, apply this framework and these indicators under each of those criteria. So I will just literally briefly say, if we're looking at human security, what really helped Ukraine, from my understanding, is that some communities were prepared. They had tabletop exercises, not all of them. And actually, COVID cooperation around pandemic helped develop some of these networks. I will not go one by one. I'll just mention some of them that I think something to keep in mind for the future. If we look at social cohesion, this remains one of the big concerns at the moment with the war and its impact on people. For example, the way in which protection of rights of vulnerable minorities, of people impacted by war, from veterans to children, and the conflicts between those who are fighting, who are not fighting, who are abroad, who are in Ukraine, is something that, risks undermining Ukrainian resilience. But overall, the purpose of the mission in Ukraine remains very strong. If we look at the governance, what we hear and see from Ukraine is there's a real concern about combating corruption. It remains an issue where people feel that actually 63% of Ukrainians believe it's a priority, because it's one of those areas that is wasting resources and also builds a feeling of injustice in Ukraine. So, if we look underneath the governance, it's one of those areas where Ukraine needs much more effort. But of course, on the upside, we're looking at the transparency of governance. We're looking about digitalization of services. Here, Ukraine is a pioneer, and actually being able to deliver a lot of services online in an open way helped Ukrainians in crisis, on the go, to be able to access services, and that contributes to Ukrainian resilience. If we look at economic agility, and something very important for society under assault, clearly for Ukraine, that is a commodity economy. Right now, the bottleneck is diversity of logistics routes, supply routes, as the Black Sea remains a very fragile supply route. The congestion through the railway, and Russian now it seems to be deliberate attack on railway hubs is undermining Ukraine resilience and needs to be addressed. And last but not least, we do know that cognitive strengths, and here I'm sure my colleagues will bringing more detail to this, but it is key for morale, it is key for society at war, and to a degree, Ukraine remains hugely consolidated. And what is quite striking, that 80% of Ukrainians have a positive vision about the future of the country. They understand that it's within their lifetime possible. And this is an immense resource for resilient society. But on the downside, I think we need to, Ukraine needs to address issues of information security, information space, the corrosive impact of some of the social media networks, especially now there's discussion about the Telegram channel. What are the pluses and minuses of this network? And also media policy at times of martial law, how much freedom there should be, which information should be censored, which information should be open. And I think this is the difficult question of society at war that also wants and is committed to be democracy. So just to finish up, when we are thinking about resilience, it's all these pillars that I've identified with some of these indicators, but it's also principles. It's a principle of how do we govern and interact in the society. And across literature, there are many of these principles that I would distill into these 4 key ones. It's inclusive approach. It means that citizens have a shared ownership of whichever process they are trying to undertake. In this particular case, it's war mobilization and it's rapid recovery. It's a reflective process that enables fast learning, and ministries and organizations can embed this. It's also something that is integrated and mutually supporting, that the pieces of the system are not disjointed. And here, I come to the last one, which is the flexibility and adaptation, where Ukraine is decentralized country. Before the war, it was a huge success, the decentralization. And building on this local knowledge, actually, Ukraine was able to save a lot of its communities from Russian invasion. People knew the geography, people knew the resources. So I hope that this framework, and we are planning to work on it further on, will be useful for us when we are looking at the resilience. And now we can take a deeper dive with 2 of our other guest speakers. Thank you. Over to you, Natalie.
Thank you, Orysia. Before we move on, I want to ask you a few questions. It's very interesting what you say about the kind of digital resilience of Ukraine. And I was reading somewhere that Ukraine is one of the most connected societies that has ever experienced interstate war, which is also a great strength, but at the same time a vulnerability, because obviously through the social media and manipulation and the kind of techniques of information war that Russia is using, that is becoming very powerful tool to undermine the societal consensus, which seems to be very strong in Ukraine. So in that context, and you mentioned that, I want to ask you about the link between democracy and resilience, because what we're talking about is boosting democratic resilience, right? Not the autocratic one. The question I have, which is kind of comes from that digitalization, is, can you say that democracies are more or less vulnerable to forces that undermine resilience? Because you may argue that openness, fairness, equal access, everything that is fundamental to democracy in some ways makes it more vulnerable to subversion and disruptive activities. So that's one question. And another is about the reforms, because Ukraine is also one of those countries, one of those rare cases, which is conducting structural high impact reforms, which is in the process of the EU accession. I don't think this has ever been done before at times of war. So what are the reforms from your experience and your knowledge that Ukraine absolutely needs to prioritize, not only to meet the standards and criteria, but to boost the resilience?
Well, very, very important questions. I think on the first one, personally, I do not use the term resilience to autocratic societies. I think it's different quality. I think it's more of a total mobilization with fear. I think systems like that, they may have endurance, but they're very brittle. They actually possess none of those 4 criteria at the very end that I said should kind of underpin organization of societal relations and affairs in a democracy. So it is a difficult task to find the right balance between allowing freedom of engagement, freedom of expression at times of war, and at the same time, keeping the nation mobilized. I don't think this actually ever happened at this level of sophistication of development of a society, quite industrialized, quite connected society like you've described. And we are in the uncharted territory. That is why it's so important to look at how Ukraine sustains basic civic services, from registering birth documents, the digital driving license, through this DIA, portal, as President Zelensky said, the governance country in the smartphone, right? Ukraine, even before the war, was the first country to recognize the digital passport. It means that your ID on the phone would be accepted in the bank or for any other state authority. So it of course must be designed in view of possible shocks and adversity that comes from digital predators, as we know, cyber crimes, but also from AI, that is upcoming threat. So it's almost, you can never rest on the laurels of your fame. And that is why this quality of reflection and adaptation is so important. And that is why I believe democracies can do it if they have these channels of communications enabled. And Ukraine, I'm sure my colleagues will describe more, having tradition of successful civic protest, having a tradition of hromadas and cooperation at the local level, have the necessary political culture to actually enable these things happening. It's easier perhaps than in some more hierarchical societies. So each country is different, but I think the principle, the organizing principle of resilient governance is the same. Yeah, I'll stop here.
Orysia, before I let you go for now, there is an interesting question from the audience. Can the barometer that you described, this is the question, be applicable also to Western European countries?
I think, yes. The idea when we were designing this was actually to make it quite generic for any country that wants to do an assessment of its resilience to foreign interference. And as I said at the beginning, it should be applicable to sharp powers, as don't know exactly who coined the term, but China, Iran, Russia. In some regions, it could even be Turkey that plays more kind of, coercive game. I think it's a rather cheap tool in a way that it's based on expert survey. And in case of Moldova, we had I believe 43 experts that answered the questions, which is quite big sample for the country. And what is interesting is that then you can use it to have an internal reflection about it. After you do a kind of a testing, you can, with civil society, with media, with government officials, discuss. For example, again, bringing the case of Moldova, where they still have quite low agreement in the society about the direction of European integration. This is the vulnerability that will be exploited by Russia in the upcoming referendum. So yes, it is possible.
Absolutely, I agree with that. Thank you very much. I think this was very interesting. So let's move on now to Julia. And you, Julia, are a historian of ideas. So I would like to ask you some of these concepts that are kind of related to resilience, such as social cohesion, such as human security, democratic security, maybe even good governance, form kind of one and the same cluster. And in Orysia's barometer, some of them, such as social cohesion and human security, are incorporated in it. So what do you think is an added value of resilience, both as a concept and as a policy tool? So share your ideas, particularly in the context of Ukraine. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you very much for the invitation to this very important talk. And I do agree with everything what Orysia just said. But what I will be talking about, it's more like critical approach to resilience, because as a historian, I tend to see this like deeper structures and maybe some threats and risks, what this Ukrainian miracle, as we all agree, like this resilience as a miracle can pose. So although I am a historian, I will start with talking about resilience from physics, like what it means for, in the physics. And when we talk about resilience there, it's a reaction of the material to stress or to the shock, right? And Resilience of the material means the amount of energy that material can absorb and still return to its original state. So if we talk about resilience in the society, so we expect it to bounce back to this original state. But what is important here is to understand that both in the physics and also in society, we need time for the material or for the people to come back to this original state. And sometimes it's not even possible to come to this original state if we speak about the society. So the question is, and here comes this more critical approach, which we with Katerina take in our report, that it's really like how we can minimize the shock. So what can we do to prevent the shock, to prevent the stress? Because Ukrainian society now is in a state of constant shock, and the Ukrainian society has no time to recover. So what can we do to replenish these resources, which are already minimal, like really on the minimum level? So I would say that one's adaptability depends on resources, and these resources are psychological, economical, mental, and social. And this is exactly all these parts what Orisa was talking about. And if we want really to maybe help Ukrainian society and be with Ukrainian society in this war, so we need to understand how we replenish all these aspects. So how we can help with this psychological resources, economical resources, mental resources, social resources, and military resources, because that now the society is in the war, and the war is done by military means. So it's not possible to talk about war without talking about the weapons. So this is also a very important part of Ukrainian resilience now at this point of history. So, and then again, like speaking as a historian, so historically speaking, while studying wars and other atrocities, we used to speak about like this dehumanization as a step which facilitates violence. And now, when we are speaking about this Ukrainian miracle, it's in a way also dehumanization which has taken place, because we think about Ukrainians as some superheroes and they can manage on their own because they are so great. They have some characteristics that others don't have. But this is not true. We all know that Ukrainians are like normal people, as all of us are. And I'm sitting in Stockholm, so it's very, very peaceful here. And I'm like, I really cannot even imagine what Ukrainians are going through a day after day. And so for me, I'm also, as a person, I'm very fascinated and I really appreciate everything Ukrainians are doing. But on the other hand, I'm asking myself, like, if we kind of mysticize it, this ability, maybe we don't ask more from ourselves, those who are sitting not in Ukraine. So this is one of the points which is troubling me in a way. And then again, as a historian who is interested in colonial experiences, I would say that a lot of post-colonial societies, they and colonial societies, they like historically, they demonstrate a very high degree of resilience in a way, because they are very good at survival. So maybe we shouldn't take for granted these survival strategies and not taking these survival strategies for resilience. Maybe these are different things also. And of course, when we look at Ukrainians and how Ukrainian society even understands the war, very often in this mass culture, Ukrainians refer to Holodomor, for instance, or to the Second World War. So they are looking for examples that they can survive. And we know that people are good at survival. But then again, we who are not in that situation, maybe we should think about how we can help Ukrainians not thinking about survival in a way. So how we maybe should take other like points of references and really think about how we can help Ukrainians not be that resilient in a way, because they really need like normal life. How we can come to this normalcy in a way, because Ukrainians are fighting for normality in a way. My greatest wish would be just for Ukrainians to come to this normalcy and for having their own state where they can allow themselves not fight for survival, not really think about survival, but be resilient in all these aspects which Orisa presented. So I think that here I can stop now, because at least here is some kind of hope, and I don't want to be very pessimistic. Thank you.
Definitely, that's very interesting. You know, when we think of Ukraine's resilience miracle, as I called it, it's associated with heroism. It's associated, on the one hand, which is good because it attracts attention, it makes it for a good headline, right? But at the same time, it can make us complacent about the costs of this resilience. And in fact, it is about heroism of survival under the conditions of war. So I think it's very important that you bring to us the actual costs, human costs, and these are both individual and collective. And I would like to follow up a little bit on what you said about post-colonial societies. In many ways, Ukraine is now fighting against colonial power, which denies that it is such. But how do you feel that Ukraine's past experience of dealing with Russia has informed its abilities to resist what it is facing right now?
I think that this is exactly what also the way decentralization helps, because people rely on their own communities more and on their hromadas. So, and this is exactly how this kind of strategies of survival work through maybe even hundreds of years, because you rely on the people who are close to you, but you then have to know who these people are, right? So this is very much about this decentralizing powers, because empires are very central. The power is very central in empires, but how you can survive by all these subversive strategies and grouping with the people who are like you and who share your values and your destiny in a way. So I think that even these examples from Holodomor, they also show that yeah, the state can be oppressive. We know that, and we know that we already were victims of that state. Of course, this victimhood, it can be very tricky, because we know it historically. But in this case, what Ukrainians seem to show that even these very tragic histories, they show that we can survive, not like we are victims, which was very often seen in memory politics of Ukraine during 90s, for instance, the beginning of 2000s. But still, what is going on since 2014, Ukrainians are seeing themselves more and more as agents and not as victims. They are survivors and they are fighters.
Yulia, I have one more question I'm very tempted to ask you, because for the purposes of resilience, we talk about psychology, we talk about economic resilience, digital, etc. But there are these intangibles as well, right? There is culture, which is so important. And if you see the destruction of cultural monuments, it is somehow particularly painful, because it almost is like a destruction of part of your national identity. And another is history. And we know that history is one of those highly contested, actually, battlefields in this war. There is an actual war of narratives going on. And you mentioned the history of colonialism, and I wonder whether you have something to tell us about, the way we tell the story, we interpret our past, how important it is for the national resilience, and also how important it is for outsiders to somehow help push that narrative, because we see what Russia is doing. Russia is positioning itself as the champion of anti-colonialism while waging a classical colonial war. And it's leaving us almost like speechless. It is so hypocritical, but we have to find ways to kind of responding to this.
Yeah, I think this is a very important question because before starting the real war, even against Georgia, for instance, Russia started these memory wars against all countries which were the part of the Soviet Union. So we can speak about the Baltic countries and the war of memorials there, and a lot of such cases, and even in Ukraine there would be hundreds of such stories how Russia was kind of attacking this memory narratives, because when the Soviet Union collapsed, all the countries of the region started retelling their story. And this is a normal process for all, like we all know, like state building, nation building. People start talking about their history and constructing their new historical narratives. But what Russia was constantly doing, accusing in this nationalist narratives, and it was very easy in the West to absorb this critique, because the Western European countries are against all kind of nationalisms. It's a very scary word. So it worked very well. But what was also interesting to see that after 2022, suddenly people, I mean, in the West realized that something was wrong with this Russian narrative, because who is really like nationalistic, chauvinistic? It's Russia, because even 2014 didn't help people to see the instant of Russian imperialism, right? And their imperialistic agenda. So I think that in a way we all were influenced by these memory wars, because it was easy in a way, easy critique. But on the other hand, now we are in the period when we are starting questioning this critique, and this is for a historian is a very interesting question, how to kind of reevaluate all these historical narratives which were criticized as too nationalistic, etc., etc.
Thanks a lot, Julia. Let's move to Katerina now. You also co-authored with Julia that paper that talks about precisely these human costs of resilience, and warns a little bit about the dangers of romanticizing too much Ukraine's resilience, so that we don't become too complacent about it. So I want you to talk to us a little bit more. What are the risks? I mean, we can see what are the sources of resilience. Both Orysia and Julia discussed them, but what are risks? What does home front need to keep going, especially in the conditions of this hybrid war? Because what Russia is doing is it's waging hybrid war against the entire West, and it has a conventional side to it, which is in Ukraine, and then much wider hybrid one. But even within Ukraine, it's a big part of the strategy is to destroy the spirits, to destroy precisely the resilience. And some of the once obscure military thinkers have now become very popular. And I will quote Messner, who says, one of the old Russian thinkers who was obscure but has been popular now among the Russian strategists, that the soul of the enemy society has become the most important strategic objective. And I think this is very true in case of Ukraine, and Russia has taken that notion quite seriously. So talk to us about the risks and the sources of this resilience. Thank you.
Natalie, thank you very much. Of course, I will talk with pleasure. I'm very grateful to my colleagues for everything that they have already said. It is very convenient not to speak first because you gather ideas and insights and you can build your speech upon them. I would definitely agree that the soul of the enemy is the key target, and there is also another expression which I've heard in our Ukrainian popular discourses, and I like it, and it says, "The moment you think you lose, you lose." So indeed, the human extent of resilience is extremely important, and I think that my colleagues already expressed very well. We should just flip the discussion upside down, or like turn it around and say that to make the stake on Ukraine's human resilience or other aspects of resilience is a loose strategy. So the other more support and intervention is needed for Ukraine's victory. And I will talk about this. I actually think that the phrase Ukraine's victory is said aloud for the first time today. Maybe I'm wrong, but and this is also indicative, right? So we're talking about how to keep Ukraine going rather than how to keep Ukraine win. And I think this is wrong. And I will explain why. This is not just my wishful thinking, but I would like to explain why everyone would benefit from Ukraine's victory. I would like to introduce the term, the concept, in addition to the types of resilience which we have discussed, as military resilience or hard power resilience. Yes, indeed, we should talk about democracy resilience, about governance resilience, but actually, as you already said, wars are fought with arms. And I will maybe reiterate that when we ask how we can sustain Ukraine's people, this is definitely the right question to ask, of course. But if we focus only on it, it means that we will spend more. And this is one of the arguments which I would like to get across, that the more this war goes on, the more Russia progresses. And actually, we think about what we get in the news, and we should be very attentive to see what we do not get in the news. But actually, Ukraine continues to lose territory. Last week as well, we lost some numbers of square kilometers. We can calculate them through deep state if we want. The point is, Russia continues to advance. Ukraine, in some districts, Ukrainians retreat. And this means that the front line comes closer to other rear cities. The more territory there is gained by Russia and even fought back, so the more territory is under occupation at any point in time, the more we will have to rebuild, the more we'll have to reintegrate, the more resources we will need. So this is one thing which I think we should articulate very clearly. One of the points on our agenda were the risks. So what are the risks right now? And I see the following risks. First, that the EU and the wider Europe, of course, not just the EU, could possibly take a more relaxed stance on the military aid to Ukraine, given that the US have approved the aid package. I know that it is quite hard, even for experts, to navigate between the sums and types of the weapons and ammunition that Ukraine gets. But the point is, and this is, I think, quite straightforward, what Ukraine will get from the US is enough to subsist, but not enough to win. Europe has already lost a year of 2023 in which it could have put in quicker, better motion the industrial complex. This is a mistake, but we should not repeat the mistake just because we've done it long enough, right? So this is the time when Europe could do as fast as possible whatever they could for their own industrial complexes, of course, because if they do not sustain their own industrial complexes, they cannot help Ukraine. But also the point is, this is not the end of the aid. Ukraine does need and will need more. Usually, people ask at this point, so what does Ukraine do? Ukraine does as much as it can. It produces. It looks into some co-productions. It has already quite developed technology, AI, drone sphere. It's one of the some really advanced spheres in Ukraine now, but not in all types of weapons. Ukraine can be very progressive. This is a very long historical thing. So. This is the common knowledge which should not be forgotten, that Ukraine does rely on the arms and weapons from its partners, and it will be so for years to come. The other risk which let's say we in Ukraine, see, me and my colleagues, let's put it this way, is the lack of vision from our partners, vision of Ukraine's victory and Russian loss. Because again, when we spend our resource, when we decide what we want to spend and for what, then we have to see some kind of end goal. And over 2 years of the full-scale invasion, I have not, or personally, I have not witnessed a serious, expert, detailed discussion of what exactly Ukraine's victory should look like and Russia's loss. I see that there is this kind of tacit agreement that Ukraine should not lose and Russia should not win. But again, with this, we only protract the resources we spend. That's it, and we prolong people's suffering. That's it. This is no kind of dead end or no end goal, and this is wrong. There should be a vision and a strategy. Again, since this is the discussion which I often engage in, when our partners would ask us what is the Ukrainian strategy, I would say we have two, as usual. We have one from the government and one from civil society. The one from the authorities is called the peace formula. It is there from 2022, offered by the President Zelensky. The one from civil society, by far the best, I think I've seen generally from many peace plans, is the Sustainable Peace Manifesto, developed by a coalition of civil society organizations. So in Ukraine, there is this vision, but I would be very happy to see that it is also shared by our partners. Last but not least, about the risks. So one risk, I said that the partners would get relaxed or take care of other issues. There are this lack of division. And third, actually very, I would say very tactical, very down-to-earth one, and this down-to-earth is not a metaphor, is the anti-missiles. So if we look at the perspective of, let's say, 1 year, within 1 year, we can see that Ukraine's anti-missile systems right now are working well, but not well enough. But there is a serious risk of, they're just not enough to cover all strategic objects, and there is a serious risk of energy crisis in Ukraine. Let's say it's not a risk, it's a given fact, but the extent of this crisis is still yet to see. Because currently the warmth production, so this part of energy production in Ukraine, is heavily destroyed. Experts have various estimations of how exactly, and it also remains, the question remains how much Ukraine will be able to rebuild over the summer. But on the other hand, it's not winter yet, so Russia still have time to send missiles and to bombard Ukraine's strategic infrastructure. So if we talk about very human, very down-to-earth, basic extent of resilience, and this is definitely what Ukraine needs support. In terms of the front line, in addition to everything that I've said, we need people, and this Ukraine is caring about it on its own. So people, weapons, and technologies. So again, there's also this saying that in Ukraine that the little post-Soviet army cannot win over large post-Soviet army. So Ukraine is looking for advanced solutions. And advanced technological solutions are, of course, the most wanted. If we speak about drone war, so drone aspect of the war, then it's extreme high-speed competition, and wins the one who offers better and faster solution. So here the technological aspect is important. But in addition to high tech, we also have to remember that the war takes place on a very basic level as well, very World War I type of the war, with trenches and small distance of shooting. So anti-missile systems, long-range missiles, and that artillery shells are as topical as ever. I would like to conclude with saying that when we speak about how to support Ukraine, we should think about the time terms. How much time do we have? And we should understand that the longer this war takes, the more everyone will pay. So I would encourage our partners to do their absolute best to help advance Ukraine's victory as fast as possible. And with this way, as I've already said, but I think it's worth reiterating, there will be much less to support and to spend. I will conclude here.
Thank you, Katarina. We definitely share your conclusion. And I would like to ask you a follow-up question. You mentioned how Ukraine is reliant on Western support on many levels, particularly in the military, and the connection between the battlefield and victory there and societal sort of morale and resilience is very close, obviously. In many ways, this reliance of Ukraine is a vulnerability, as we have seen, right? Because with the delay of aid package, there's been a lot of damage done. And this damage cannot be just undone because the decision has been taken. Now we have to deal with the support coming in, but already with the changing conditions on the ground that you have mentioned. On the other hand, there is no other European country, for example, who would be able to fight this kind of war alone. So they would all, any one of them would need this kind of support. So it's not special for Ukraine to be dependent on others' help. But given the damage, given this vulnerability, yet an incredible optimism of the society, I would like to ask you maybe uncomfortable question, but how disappointed Ukrainians were with the Western support and with this delay, and how does it impact both the battlefield and the translation of it to the society? Thank you.
Natalie, in the first place, thank you very much for this absolutely wonderful argument about not being able to fight this war alone. I'm noting down and I will use it now in all my discussions. This is really brilliant. And also advances, of course, the argument of why Ukraine should be in NATO. In terms of the disappointment, I actually inquired into this issue several times. Because Ukraine's relations with the EU and NATO and Western, but the US, sometimes they have their fluctuation as well. And I'm looking into whether societal moves are changing. And I can see that if we speak specifically about European and Atlantic integration, it remains cast in stone. We have 80+% of support always, ever, whatever goes. Yeah? Whether the Senate, the Congress would approve or not the aid, or whether we have some, not yet the negotiations, not yet opened, or the framework of negotiations not yet approved with the European Commission. People probably maybe are not aware of all these intricacies. They just know that the EU is so the normative norms provider of quality of life and welfare, and also security, actually. And NATO is, of course, the number one security provider, or one and only security provider, and nothing can replace it. So we can be happy or unhappy with the United States, for example, but we know that we are reliant on them. And I think in this regard, there are no kind of fluctuations, no disappointment as far as the general public is concerned. I would also say that actually, and this again, of course, comes to the issue of human resilience. People in Ukraine are super tired. I mean, maybe it's not that visible abroad, and also I don't think that many polls capture it, especially those who are translated in other languages. But basically, there is a lot of societal bickering over many things, and this is unrelated to Western partners. We have a lot to argue about between ourselves.
Sorry. Thank you, Katarina. There is one question that I would like to address to all of you, because there were several reiterations of that question from the audience, and some of you have mentioned it, and that has to do with corruption. I mean, how important do you think corruption is as a factor undermining sustainable resilience of Ukraine? There was also a story about as soon as you hear, particularly when it comes to military spending, some that stories hit the headlines, and that creates a very kind of a bad image. It very quickly takes over, so it has actual costs to Ukraine among the public opinion here in the West. So I'm curious, what do you think about the role of corruption? Is there such a thing as culture of corruption? And that's something that's been debatable. And someone coming from Georgia, I have an opinion on this, but I would like to hear what you think about it. And in one of the publications, Arisia, I think you describe it as a neo-patrimonial economy, right, Ukraine? So do you think that this war can actually bring an end to the oligarchic business practices to Ukraine? because it has been linked also to support of these oligarchs to Russia and so on, and how important it is for the reconstruction effort as well. So different dimensions, but all around corruption, which I think is a big issue. So whoever wants to go first. Maybe Orysia, you go first.
I'll go quickly. I think in Ukrainian psyche, when Ukrainians are looking at what's happening in the country, corruption is very much related to the question of justice. And it has two dimensions. One is whether a Ukrainian citizen, business person, or a teacher can defend their rights in front of the courts. And that is a question of rule of law, and that's a question of equal representation in law. And this is where there's a feeling that there is a privileged class that have a certain access or capture of certain courts, and that they feel that has to be sorted. Then another question is the question of actually resource abuse, resource capture, and loss of resources. That is something that Yulia and Katerina in their paper describe, Ukrainians individually donating so much to the Ukrainian armed forces. They are donating to a specific battalions, they are donating to various charities. 80% of Ukrainians donate, and they feel like if we are donating whatever we have, the state should have optimized and have effective use of resources. And this is the discussion. These are two pillars of looking at resilience. And Ukraine is improving. If you look at Transparency International Corruption Perception Index, which again measures perception, not corruption per se, Ukraine moved to still quite low, 104th place in 2023, but it's between Brazil and Serbia. And Ukrainians are dissatisfied with that because they want better. I think actually it's good. If Ukrainians were satisfied with that result, we should be worried. And overall, I think that we sometimes confuse effectiveness of institution or ineffectiveness with corruption. And we have to be very careful to distinguish. Ukraine has also inherited the system of governance, which is not very high quality. Let's be honest. If you look at the World Bank rating of governance, Ukraine ranks quite low. It still has a lot to do to catch up with Poland. So I think that there's a pressure from Ukrainian civil society, media, to make sure that every hryvnia, every dollar, every euro that the country has in its possession, that the government has, goes to the war efforts to support the veterans. And this is the question of justice. And I'm sure they will keep the pressure on the government, and together with European Union, with United States, there will be cleanup of a lot of inefficiencies that still are within the system.
Thank you. Katerina or Yulia, would you like to comment on that? Yes, go ahead, Katerina.
Yes, I would indeed like to comment on this. In addition to what Arisa has said, I would like to flag another concept which I think would be useful here is the corruption perception inertia. What I mean by this is that we get into very, very knowledgeable expert discussions within people who have studied corruption for years. Then they would all agree and provide evidence for the fact that Ukraine's corruption situation has improved immensely over the last 10 years. So when we speak about, for example, this petty kind of corruption, day-to-day corruption, then it has decreased heavily thanks to the digital tools which have been introduced in education, in healthcare, in public service provision. So this interaction between the citizen and state has diminished so much that it's not possible, right, to give a bribe to the system, and it's anyway so efficient you don't need to. There are surveys which are implemented consistently by USAID Engage. I will send it into chat as soon as I find it right now after I speak, which ask the following question. Do you think corruption is a problem? And the majority of people say, yes, we think it's a problem. Have you experienced corruption in the last year, in the last 12 months? And the number of people who would say yes is super low, so like within 10%. I think this is a very good illustration of, yes, I think corruption is a problem, but I don't encounter it. I just see the reports of it. Now let's speak about the report. The report is also a tricky issue that on the one hand, if there are no reports, it means that we cannot track corruption. And if there are reports, it means that there is a lot of corruption. So it's a vicious circle, which is really hard to counter. And from my perspective, the instances of corruption and the work of corruption counter institutions, which have been set up after the Revolution of Dignity, actually demonstrate that corruption is tracked and is punished, at least to some extent. So I see that some important cases, even during the wartime after the Falkland invasion, have been tracked down, published, and investigated. So to me, it's a good sign. But I would say that we have this, as I said, corruption perception inertia, which is present both within Ukraine and especially outside Ukraine. And this, I say especially, that actually works against providing Ukraine with aid, unfortunately. I would say that for any decision maker who would want to base his or her opinion on the extent of corruption in Ukraine, I would definitely recommend to consult the top experts in the field. There are many. We have anti-corruption institutions. So the abbreviation is ANTAC. Looking for maybe my colleagues can help me, headed by Daria Kalanyuk, for example, Oksana Hus, and there are many other Ukrainian international experts who would give a very evidence-based assessment with hard indicators. When we talk about general perception, I would say that it is deviating from reality.
I will just add something, because it's also about the expectations and the perceptions. What I think is very clear now, when millions of Ukrainians come to the Western Europe or to the USA, whatever, and then they encounter that some system is not working in the way they expected, and they realize that actually in Ukraine it was not that bad, so it was still functioning and very effective. And then speaking from Sweden, which is perceived as like anti-corrupted heaven, and even here when people see that some things don't work, they see it as corrupted system in a way. So this is exactly how people perceive it. But also I think that the Revolution of Dignity and the Orange Revolution show that Ukrainians really are struggling for justice. They want to have a society which is transparent, fair, and maybe Ukrainians have even like high expectations from justice than others in Europe, I think.
Thanks a lot. We have some very interesting questions, but before I pose them, the questions from the audience, I would like to invite Oksana Lemishka from the audience, who's an independent researcher on media and culture, and she's associate member at the Center for Sustainable Peace and Democratic Development, and also an author of the upcoming book, How to Invest in Invisible. If you're there, Oksana, you will be unmuted, and I would like to hear your impressions of this discussion, and tell us a little bit on the importance of human well-being, on the importance of culture that we touched upon a little bit in this discussion for boosting resilience, and what Ukraine's experience tells us about it.
Thank you so much, Natalie. I don't know how to switch on the camera, by the way, or is it in your hands? Can you hear me?
We can hear you well, but the camera is not in my hands.
Okay. Then I apologize. I have problems then to switch it on. Thank you so much for the questions and also for the discussion. In my work, I often feel like an outsider bringing flowers to the topic. But today I feel like all the three speakers enriched what I do, and also what I do could be valid for this discussion. So speaking about resilience, I thank Yulia so much for bringing the topic that resilience is a myth and it is rather a survival. I agree with this stance so much. And studying Ukrainians and doing sociological research with Ukrainians, I see how we need to refocus efforts of donors and funds and to invest in invisible. What do I mean? We need to speak of culture of resistance, a culture of recovery, and a mindset of recovery. We had this problem before full-scale invasion, when culture of of recovery was not very often present in everyday practices. I mean, walking in the parks, bringing flowers to the tables at home, having long discussions, and having less exposure to digital gadgets. This all makes daily life of every person a little bit better. And also, so, okay, now I can, here I am. Hello, everyone. Thank you for, then this is one thing, is just to look how daily lives can be better. Another one is this human-centered approach that we were talking. To my surprise, not a single company, not a single donor adapted their practices in Ukraine for Ukrainians. Nobody said you can be late for work after missile attacks. Nobody said you can take Friday off if you have any tiredness or you're living in an area which is heavily attacked. More than that, when I asked a donor, one donor, why we can't have a conference in a nice place abroad and we are going to a city which is a little bit heavy, even though in a smaller place it is cheaper, he said that it will change donors' optics. It means if people rest, it's not work. So we all have to think a little bit more how we change the optics and how we have more kinder approach to each other and to Ukrainians. And last but not least, what I wanted to say is, when I think Orissa's introduction of resilience as a term is very important. At all international events, I ask not only about how we help Ukraine, but how we help ourselves. Today in the morning, I was listening how economy is a description of success of a country. For example, India is said to be, by Davos participants, a leading economy, one of the leading economies. And sociologically, we know that Indian population is struggling a lot on a human-to-human level. So maybe we need to redefine how we approach measuring success of the country and introducing resilience into the rooms where bringing flowers is considered to be non-efficient. And here I am to help with that. And I thank a lot for this conversation. Super excited.
Thanks a lot, Oksana, for bringing flowers. I think this is very important and definitely an extremely important aspect of resilience, because ultimately, I mean, we talk about societies, which is kind of an abstract thing. We talk about states, but this all consists of humans, right? And we have our human needs. So I see Maria has joined us as well. Maria, I would like to ask you, you are a director of Center Ukraine. You work a lot with local communities, and your center has recently come up with a new study on how communities survive. So we've been talking kind of a macro level, but bring us a little bit down to the grassroots and how the resilience is experiencing there, and from your expertise. Thank you.
Thank you for inviting. My name is Maria Levonova. I'm an executive director at Center of United Actions. In October to February, we held a research on capacity of local self-governance to govern in conditions of war and reconstruction. And we analyzed the results of 60 face-to-face interviews with representatives of local self-government from 12 territorial communities in 6 oblasts, including Chernihiv, Dnipropetrovsk, Odessa, Kyiv, Sumy, and Kharkiv oblasts. I will briefly share the findings and recommendations to international community based on them. Local governments continue to provide a full range of services to their residents, and with international assistance, they develop their capacities to become more resilient. They learned how to use available resources in the most effective way. They became more adaptive. They replan expenditures in response to changing circumstances and focus on basic needs. Funds protected budget items, social security programs, and aid to the army. First, the primary challenge for communities is safety. Communities are raising additional resources to repair existing shelters and build new ones as best they can. Second, reduction of funding is the biggest problem for local governments. Local budgets decreased by 30 to 40% compared to 2021, based on the interviews, as a result of closing and relocation of businesses, introduction of tax breaks in the frontline regions, and redirection of part of the taxes from local budgets to the state one. Then local governments restore the most urgent facilities on their own, but most communities need to raise funds from outside and actively cooperate with international, charitable, and civic organizations to attract additional resources in a variety of areas. Communities compete with each other for international assistance. As a result, the aid often goes not to those with the most crucial need, but to those most capable of creating necessary documentation. Participation in international programs requires a large number of supporting documents, including development strategies, recovery plans, but this develops the local authorities' capacity in long-term perspective. Still, there is lack of communication between the state authorities and local governments on these strategic documents. Reduction in product-based humanitarian aids and the redirection of humanitarian flows to long-term projects affect the ability of communities to help vulnerable groups, especially IDPs. National reform implementation is ongoing in communities where they launch reorganization of networks within education, healthcare, and culture reforms before the full-scale invasion. It's much harder in the communities that couldn't launch them before. Challenges they face. First is a shortage of personnel for service provision in the communities. For example, teachers and doctors just leave, depending on the community, how close it is from the front line to the front line. Then lack of staff to work in utility companies due to mobilization is a huge trouble. And local councils lack skilled people for grant writing, but also for simplifying bureaucratic processes and for internal optimization of their work in the areas of good governance and reform process. Local residents resist to reorganization because they do not understand the national reform, and communication of the national authorities on national reforms process is pretty chaotic and imperative, but at the same time, the pressure from the central government to local self-government is constantly increasing, especially on redistribution of funds and increased reporting. Additional complexity in reconstruction process is created by internal migration. The municipal infrastructure should be adopted to meet urgent needs, but also further integration of IDPs, veterans, and people with disabilities as a new priority are at place. On recommendations for the international community, first, cooperate with communities directly. Despite the fact that communities have similar problems, each individual local government knows their context best. They also gather data that is not always available publicly for security reasons. Communicate with officials appointed or elected, not with NGOs, committees, advisors, etc., to make final decisions. Engage local NGOs in project on the stage of project launch and implementation. Local initiatives and activists have extensive experience working with the challenges of full-scale invasion, and they can cover both citizen engagement, analytic blocks of the projects. They can help develop strategic plans, other documents that are needed, but also they can help to report on the projects. Align funding with local and national policies. Things that should be taken into account are the community strategic documents, local policies and projects, but also the national reforms that are ongoing. When working on education, healthcare, and culture infrastructure, it's important to consider the national reforms requirements. Then, considering the context of European integration, local governments do not have the perspective of EU integration in their daily work, but at the same time, there is already national legislation adopted for EU integration that will be implemented on the local level. For example, the waste management policy. If this perspective is not considered during the recovery and reconstruction, we will probably have to consider it later and pay twice within the EU accession process. And also, what is important is to keep in mind the decentralization reform and balance of powers inside Ukraine, because we need them for the future of our democracy. That's all from my side.
Thanks a lot, Maria. I think this was very interesting and always useful to look at the local level, because these are the building blocks of state resilience, I would say. There are two questions that I would like to pose to our panelists from the audience. One has to do with Russia, and actually Russia's own resilience. And that's something that I had in mind too when I was thinking about this webinar. We speak about Ukraine's resilience, we speak about how miraculous it is and incredible, but Russia has proven to be quite resilient as well. And Russia has proven to be, you know, a formidable adversary to the West. I mean, not only to Ukraine, we're not talking here about Ukraine. Sanctions, well, it seems to have done pretty well, dodging sanctions. International isolation, it seems to have done well too. I mean, it has kind of refocused from the West, but found its audience elsewhere. And in many ways, we have seen how Russia is skinfully exploiting at the international level divisions and you know, sort of accumulated grievances that are in other parts of the world against the West and leading to the further bifurcation of the global order. So there was a question on what can we do? What are the other measures that you think need to be taken in order to help Ukraine and undermine what Russia is doing pretty well? So that's one question, and I let you think about it, whoever wants to take it. And then there is another question also about kind of continuing from the post-colonial experience, and it was about how to avoid in the future mistakes, the problems that Ukraine has had from its own past, from its own process of democratization and transition, as well as the experience that we have seen in many other countries that have gone through transition, including post-colonial countries that are still suffering from corruption, from bad governance, etc. So how do we make sure that this doesn't happen? And how important of a guarantor is European accession here? And maybe we can bring that question onto the table as well. So whoever wants to take whichever question, maybe I start with Orysia.
Thank you for bringing it to the adversary. Obviously, you have to understand the nature of it because, you know, if we want to build defense, security, and resilience, we need to understand the nature of the enemy. And I mean, in my mind, we can call this system, you know, brittle stability. I think Russia doesn't have you know, the flexibility in its own system, but it has one feature that is advantage. It is ready to marshal resources. The West, combined collective West, has resources. It has innovation. It has technology. It, you know, says Ukraine is defending the European way of life, and it's a direct quote, you know, from the president of the European Commission. But it is basically self-deterring. And it's falling in the Russian trap, I think, partially because of the decades of being entangled through Russian presence of economy, industry, corrupt practices, having proxy groups. We are now being exposed to a lot of investigations of both, you know, active measures through the Russian military intelligence, through, you know, basic, you know, buying in decision makers in the West to act on Russian behalf. So this is where we are. We cannot end up from being in that much dependence to being in such, you know, active position immediately. But I think what Katerina was saying is very important. Strategically, the problem is that the West is not taking a decision to deliver, you know, the victory of Ukraine. And by that, I mean defeat Russian troops on Ukrainian sovereign territory. And the escalation management, given Russia is a nuclear power, prevailed the winning of the war strategy. And this is where we are this year. And this position may change, it may not change, it's still up in the open. But I think it's imperative that there's an understanding that the time, the longer this lasts, the more damage it is, the more times it gives to Russia, Iran, and China to regroup, to adapt, and to come at it, and the more Western societies will be, you know, investing in defense if Ukraine is crippled and Putin makes advancements. So this is how I would see it.
Thanks, Orysia. I'll go to Katerina and then Yulia.
Indeed, we cannot know what can break the camel's back, Similarly, probably to disintegration of the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics, USSR, many people could not predict it when it was very close. So I would say that the oscillation within Russia, Russian weakness in whichever terms, so weakness of the regime, weakness of the internal republics, some possible secessionist moves, so on and so forth, there is some higher and lower possibility of that. We cannot know what exactly will arise at which point. Of course, again, we speak about the sanctions that can be bypassed, and indeed they can be. But this is, as I always stress, this is also the tool with which violators are at least punished and other potential violators are advised. This is what follows. So I would, in any case, I would say that these are the measures which should have been introduced and should be introduced until they are all the measures which are possible. And here I come to the point of whether we have tried everything against Russia. No, we have not, and this is the good news. So we still have the arsenal to explore. I would say that if we look at the roots of this war, in my perspective, this is the war about ideas. So there is this idea in Putin's head and in the heads of many Russians that Ukraine should not exist. This is part of Russia, and so this war has been started. This is completely irrational and maybe hard to grasp, but that's how they think. So from this perspective, I always say that when, for example, Ukraine is granted a NATO invitation, and here we should be very careful because an invitation to NATO is not the accession to NATO. So these are two different things and also a long process to go. And Swedish and Finnish examples are very eloquent in that. Even these states, despite high interoperability, had to wait and had some obstacles of their own. So this is the signal to Putin that this war is lost for him anyway. Ukraine will never become part of the Russian world, part of Russia, and so on and so forth. So I would say that at least, at a minimum, this step, which from the perspective of Ukraine doesn't cost that much, from the perspective of NATO members and specifically Washington costs a lot. And we, I think, see it so far differently, but we continue to work to persuade our partners in trying this. At least this could actually tip the scale. So I would say that we have to try all the tools we have, and at some point we will succeed.
Go ahead, Julia.
So I will just take on this brittle stability of Russia, and I think that here where I maybe can see some hope, because this is exactly what resilience is. It's flexibility, but Russia in this way cannot be flexible because it is dependent on old structures which are slow structures as well. So maybe if Ukraine, as Katerina said, comes with some unexpected solutions, because we really didn't try everything what maybe is possible, it can be something what can help Ukraine win. But on the other hand, we are dealing with nuclear power, and even if it's very stable, very old, but it matters. And here this is of course we all understand this is the major danger. And here I think that the only thing what can help Ukrainians, it's NATO and EU membership. Even if it is an invitation, even if everyone understands it takes years, maybe even like dozens of years, but still, when Russia and the world understands that now there is no way back, it won't be a part of this Russian sphere of influence. And here we come to this question of post-colonial challenges, because I see it that Ukraine is now struggling for this disentanglement from colonial structures because of what Orisa just mentioned, of these proxies and everything what maybe we even don't know yet, how much Russia was infiltrated in Ukrainian governance. So I think that here again what post-colonial societies can teach us that with independence, like real independence, it comes a lot of other challenges, and this de facto independence don't really, or the jure independence not really means de facto independence, because then we can speak about neocolonialism and clientelism and all these problems which don't disappear on their own.
Thank you very much. Thanks, Orissia, for unmuting me. We have about 5 minutes left, and I would like to ask for your wrap-up comments, mainly focusing on recommendations. From your experience, what would you recommend Ukraine's government, as well as Western supporters of Ukraine, what concrete measures can be taken? What policy choices should be made, in your view, to help Ukraine boost resilience? And another question, which is, I'm interpreting the question from audience because it wasn't very clear, but if I understand correctly, and we spoke about resilience, normally we speak about it in positive terms because we talk about resilience in democratic societies. But very often our societies are transition democracies. They're not consolidated, sustainable democracies. And there is always this danger that even such positive agenda that comes with resilience can be instrumentalized for negative purposes. So there was a question, what if, for example, resilience, societal resilience, becomes or translates into states' resilience to actually resist democratic change, that strengthens states so much that it can become a threat to human security rather than something that promotes and supports it. In the transition democracies, this can be a real danger. So I would like you to reflect on this, and following from this, maybe offer some concrete suggestions to those who are in the policymaking circles. Thank you. Let me start with Katarina this time.
Thank you. I think I have already provided some tips of advice for the international partners of Ukraine, to whom I should always stress, of course, Ukraine is very grateful to all the support which has been provided. And I will probably speak a bit more about the domestic audience and about my recommendations, or rather maybe expectations from the authorities in Ukraine. I could hear some aspects of these fears in your question, Natalie, about the potential authoritarian backsliding in Ukraine. And I would say that this is a valid fear, right? The country is at war. There's martial law, which limits the civic liberties. So this is a valid question to discuss. I can say that I have my own fears as well, but not so much about authoritarianism. I will explain. I think that in Ukraine, the authorities, and specifically, that we have mono-majority in the parliament and the same, and the president representing the same party. So we have this mono-power in Ukraine, and actually it was so since 2019, not since 2022. And this government, these authorities are so much afraid of people's dislike of losing their support that they failed to pass, for example, let's say strict law mobilization. They removed many unpopular measures and adopted the law, which is much lighter than the version discussed. And this is specifically about still being light, still competing for people's approval. I think this is one of the examples of why Ukraine is still a democratic state, with the authorities still seeking popular support, despite the fact that there are no elections in sight. There are other aspects which Yulia also touched upon. So a very strong local resilience, aka local governance, aka decentralization. So these are three synonyms in Ukraine. This is something which is not visible if you look at Kyiv, the central apparatus, but when we see decentralized, then we would see how much these local competences actually help to be resilient, but also continue to work as the controllers of democracy, even under the martial law. And I can go on. This is not to say
we are running out of time, Katerina. So I'm sorry to interrupt you. So maybe I give Orisia and Yulia 1 minute to share. But that was very useful. Thank you.
Place to conclude, may I?
Yes, go ahead.
I would advise the Ukrainian government to be honest and be professional, because the honesty of messages and the professionalism of expertise is what I personally like.
Thank you. Yes. Orisia, quickly.
So on the question of where we are in the democratic transition, I think the problem of the last jump or the last kilometer in Ukraine's case and in other cases like Georgia, Moldova, is actually a genuine independence, division of powers of the branches of power all checks and balances. And I think this is where it's hard to do it during the war, but I think it's important that Ukrainians are fighting for. And on recommendations, I think it's so important that now at this moment, Ukrainian people trust Ukrainian state. And based on this trust, a lot can happen. So that means listening to Ukrainian people and communities. That means collaborative governance, because I personally think it's not a miracle of resilience. It was the quality of institutions that was born in Ukraine as the result of a revolution of dignity. And Putin attacked Ukraine at its strongest, not at its weakest. And just to find, I think for that, you also need to massively increase the flow of data and communication and information, because this is how people orient themselves in time, and it's so important for resilience. And lastly, I think an important concept of well-being policy, which actually in the UK here, Richard Layard promotes quite a lot as a policy, not just as an indicator, puts mental health as number one, life satisfaction important. So we should, whoever has solutions to mental health crisis, try them in Ukraine, engage with Ukrainians. The First Lady herself is very much, working on this. So I think one of the recommendations would be this.
Thanks a lot, Orisia. Yulia, final word is yours.
I agree with
Briefly.
everything. So recommendations are take Ukrainians seriously and all their expectations seriously. So NATO, EU, and Ukrainian government listen more to their people and trust more their people. That's it.
Well, thanks a lot. I think this brings us to a wonderful conclusion. It's been an excellent discussion. I enjoyed every minute of it, and I hope our audience did. There were some good questions, and thank you very much for the panelists, and hope to continue this discussion, maybe also apply the same lens to other settings and see what conclusions we can draw. Thank you.
Thank you.